Welcome back, everyone. This video has a very simple goal, namely to encourage just a little bit of biblical literacy in the Muslim world. Let's start by hearing how not to read the Bible.
I want to comment on what he said and also Robert's remark about us endorsing the punishment for apostasy. Yes, we do. Why? Because our claim is that we are actually faithful to our scriptures. You guys are not. You want to avoid the Old Testament, and I want to give you an analogy, Patrick, because you're a business guy. You have many businesses, okay? And you have policies that you have to put in place based on social interaction in the workplace and all that kind of stuff. Now, you may make amendments to those policies based on new data, new information, how things are actually going based on those things that you put in place. Now, when you do, right, and this is the analogy between the Old Testament and the New Testament, are you willing to say that, well, yeah, thinking to myself, yeah, Pat, yeah, you were wrong, actually, when you said it was okay to do such and such. That was actually wrong, and you then put in the correct one. With the Bible, the problem that you have is the same one that you want to talk about, the loving Jesus Christ himself, which we also adore and respect as a prophet, is the same one that you believe is God and revealed the Old Testament, and you can't get out of that. So when your God, Jesus, revealed at that specific time, as I just read the passage, and I can read you plenty more where he says to kill babies in war. Is it okay to target infants in war and kill babies? Is that inherently immoral? The problem that you have is if you go on, and this is why the argument is so important. It's not a tu quoque just as a fallacious argument. It's checking for your consistency as a Christian, whether or not you're actually faithful to your own text and tradition. And the reality is you're not.
He says that, oh, well, our religion adapts, our religion changes. But that's actually the problem, Patrick. You know, when we're talking about wokeism, when we're talking about, like, if you can say that, oh, well, you know, that's the Old Testament is for those times, it's not applicable now, right? That's the argument. The violence, the killing of blasphemers, that's for old times. We've changed, but Muslims are not willing to change.
For brevity, I'm going to call this the static method. It's popular not because it's a responsible or defensible reading strategy, but because it suits the Muslim apologetic agenda. However, some more noble-minded Muslims may want to read the Bible more intelligently. And for Christians watching, this may help you in your discourse with your Muslim friends. So let's get back to what I'm calling the static reading method. You saw it in the video. Let me briefly illustrate. In the Old Testament, the death penalty is required for apostasy. By the way, when it comes to texts like these, don't assume that you can interpret an ancient Near Eastern legal code with just a surface level reading, but we don't have time for that rabbit hole now. Meanwhile, no such penalty exists in the New Testament, and where there are several examples that could be classified as apostasy or close enough, like Judas, Peter's "get behind me, Satan" moment, or the person given over to sin in 1 Corinthians, nothing close to the death penalty is even hinted at being carried out in the New Testament. At this point, Muslim apologists say, look at this shocking difference. Christianity is so inconsistent. This is the static method. You take a snapshot of something in the Old Testament and then compare it to something else in the Old Testament or the New Testament, and then assert discontinuity and incoherence. I'm calling this the static reading method because I want you to focus on the opposite, movement. In the Old Testament, the entire Bible, it all has a narrative flow to it. The Bible isn't a pond, it's a river. It's moving, and the narrative wants readers in that river moving with it. So in contrast to a static reading, I'd like you to attempt a dynamic reading with me. We just pick a point in the narrative and then ask what came before and what comes after. You'll quickly see this isn't an arbitrary reading method that's imposed on the text, but it's how it's supposed to be read. Let's look at a few examples. Consider the concept of priesthood. Exodus 19:6 is a very important verse that speaks of Israel becoming a kingdom of priests. As lofty as that sounds, it's not the end goal. This verse is only expressing a temporary arrangement. Informed readers know this because they've already seen the priestly themes that converged on creation, but never reached a terminus. So Exodus 19:6 leaves a lot to be desired. Isaiah knew this and prophesied of a time when people from all nations would serve as priests. The Levitical distinction will one day dissolve. It's no surprise that New Testament authors saw the work of Christ as advancing Old Testament priestly theology in important ways. Let's do another variation on the same verse, Exodus 19:6. This time, let's look at another concept in the verse, Israel as a nation. Again, we could ask, is this God's final goal for his people? A static reading may say yes, and that would be wrong. The creation blessing in Genesis 1:28 is worldwide. God's people filling the earth as his image bearers. There's no concept of a national identity. There's no need for one. In Genesis 12, God narrows the plan drastically to only two people, Abraham and Sarah. But the goal is still grand, to bless all the nations of the earth. This blessing of all the nations through God's people is glimpsed in some really fascinating ways, even in Genesis. For example, God blesses Egypt with provision through a famine, through Joseph in the latter chapters of Genesis. Moving to Exodus, when the Israelites left Egypt, a mixed multitude went with them in Exodus 12. Exodus 22 is one of the many places where Israel is reminded not to oppress foreigners among them, because they were once oppressed in Egypt. The Psalms and the prophets frequently speak of people from all nations worshiping God, a scene depicted vividly in Revelation 5, perfectly in line with Old Testament theology. So is Israel as a single holy nation devoted to God the culmination of God's plan? No, of course not. It's a very important part of the story, but it's only a part. How do we know? Well, the references I'm giving you, and there are many more, drive us to that conclusion. The biblical narrative flows, and to understand it, we have to look at what comes before and after. I'm sure you have the hang of it by now, so let's do one that's a little bit more complex. In Exodus 15, we have an ancient poem celebrating Israel's exodus from Egypt. Verse 13 continues the celebration, but note the shift. That starts at verse 14, describing nations that Israel has not encountered yet. The inhabitants of Philistia, the chiefs of Edom, the leaders of Moab, the inhabitants of Canaan. God will deliver from those nations as well. How? Well, the future will look just like the past, and the past provides assurance of the future. Just as the waters of the sea formed a wall for Israel to pass through, the Lord will also allow his people to pass by these hostile nations. And then, not surprisingly, the text speaks in garden mountain imagery and of the sanctuary of the Lord and God planting his people in his presence. Obviously, our minds are drawn back to Eden. Let's go back to the illustration one more time just to see how this looks. The Exodus event, again, directs readers backwards and forwards. It clearly refers back to creation using mountain and garden imagery, speaking of God's sanctuary. These are all conceptually linked in the ancient world and explicitly connected in Scripture. See, for example, Ezekiel 28. And Exodus 15 echoes other new creation events in the past, like Genesis 9. However, the prophets looked back at Exodus as a pattern for future salvation. We see this in Hosea and Isaiah, among others. Readers are not surprised to see the authors of the New Testament recalling these themes, as they show Jesus is the new Moses, this time delivering his people from the bondage of sin. So let's think through some other examples briefly. Was the temple the divine ideal? Well, no. Even Solomon's temple couldn't compare to the design of Eden and the royal and priestly functions intended for all of human creation. Is slavery the divine ideal? No. The Old Testament assumes what was the reality of the ancient Near Eastern socioeconomic structure. What's upstream of slavery? Well, the creation model, where all people are part of God's royal priesthood. What's downstream of slavery? All the captives will be set free. The prophet spoke, as we saw, of people from all nations uniting in worship of the true God. That's the goal. Is the Torah itself the divine ideal? Well, no. Looking backwards, we realize that the Torah was given after humans had fallen, and that was the context in which it was supposed to function, a fallen world. But even the Torah points beyond itself, as the prophets knew, which is why they spoke of a new covenant and a new, deeper relationship with God, God dwelling with his people, the goal of creation. This was a goal only briefly realized through the Old Testament and impossibly far out of reach by the time the Hebrew Bible ends. That is, of course, unless the Hebrew Bible points forward to something else, yet again, and it does. The prophets affirm that same old theme from primeval history. God will dwell with his people. People are, by the way, the reason that there are so many twists and turns in the biblical narrative flow. God frequently works through fallen people, and that's a messy enterprise. Why that is, I don't know, other than to say the God of the Bible sees something in humanity worth redeeming and using for his purposes. Well, having produced a video attempting to help Muslims read the Bible, I acknowledge that there are at least a few reasons why this may be difficult. To be perfectly honest, Muslim Dawagandists have a long history of interpreting the Bible in the stupidest way possible to suit their agenda, which they pass on to the rest of the Muslim world. They don't read what's there, and they read into what's not, like all of their ridiculous assertions about Muhammad in the Bible. Muslim propagandists pass this stuff on to their followers, which their followers enthusiastically and immediately begin repeating as a means of strengthening their own faith. A responsible reading of the Bible turns all of this upside down. Thus, it's a difficult option for Muslims to choose. Second, the more Muslims learn to follow the flow of the Bible, the more they realize that the thematic river does not flow to anything Islam. Islam standing far outside of and even against thousands of years of biblical history is not what Muslims have been taught to believe about their supposedly Abrahamic religion. And third, reading the Bible is strongly discouraged, if not prohibited, by many Muslim authorities. This means Muslims primarily get their Bible information from their apologists, which takes us back to number one. In spite of those difficulties, if this video helps even one Muslim, then it was worth it. Hopefully there are some Christians out there who found this informative and useful as well for their dialogue with Muslims. But let me know what you think in the comments section. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.